I know most of you don't remember me, but I know all of you.
When I first heard that Hollywood was taking another shot at Masters of the Universe, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. For decades, He-Man existed in this strange place in popular culture. For some people, he's an iconic hero. For others, he's a nostalgic toy line. And for an entire generation, he's become more of a meme than a character. So walking into this film, my biggest question was whether they could recreate the action or the spectacle. It was whether they could make me care about He-Man. And surprisingly, I think they did. Now, before I get into the spoilers, I want to talk about something that struck me almost immediately when I saw the film. This version of Adam, who turns into He-Man, isn't introduced as a natural warrior. In the opening flashbacks, we see a young prince who doesn't seem particularly interested in fighting. He doesn't possess that instinctive attraction to conflict that fantasy heroes often are expected to have. And that becomes important because everyone around him seems to have a very different idea of who he should be. His father, King Randor, is particularly concerned by Adam's lack of interest in strength and battle. At one point, he attempts to teach his son an important lesson, but in doing so, he ends up embarrassing him publicly. What I found interesting about this scene is that it doesn't present the king as a villain, but in many ways he's doing what fathers throughout history have tried to do. He's attempting to prepare his son for a difficult world. He's trying to teach him resilience, decisiveness, and courage, which is essential for men in any world, whether fantasy or modern day. But the film also understands something many people can relate to. Sometimes the lesson that's meant to make us stronger leaves us with wounds of their own. Sometimes the pressure to become who others expect us to be can create insecurities that follow us into adulthood. And that's where I think Masters of the Universe finds something surprisingly human beneath all the fantasy. The movie isn't really about a magic sword. It's about expectations, the expectations of fathers, the expectations of kings, the expectations of heroes, and ultimately the expectations Adam places on himself. Fortunately, the film balances these heavier themes with some genuinely entertaining moments. One of the standout characters for me was Duncan, also known as Man-at-Arms, played by Idris Elba. Adapting a beloved character is never easy, but the film gives him enough humor and personality to make him immediately likable. His presence keeps the story grounded and prevents the mythology from becoming too overwhelming in my eyes. Fans of the franchise will also enjoy spotting familiar faces. Characters like Ram-Man, Mechanic, Fisto make appearances during the attack on the castle, serving as a nice nod to longtime fans without completely distracting from the main storyline and the main plot. And speaking of fan service, perhaps my favorite Easter egg in the entire movie has to be the Dolph Lundgren cameo. There's a scene in the gym where Adam approaches a set of weights and Dolph tells him, "You're my spot. You're taking my spot." On the surface, it's a simple joke, but for longtime fans, it's also a clever acknowledgement of what this movie represents. A new actor stepping into a role that Lundgren himself brought to life nearly 40 years ago. It's brief, but it's exactly the kind of self-aware moment that works. Now, without getting too deep into spoiler territory, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is the film's strongest idea. Throughout fantasy storytelling, swords often symbolize power. They often are a one-of-one symbol of a leader or a king or a hero. Think of Lord of the Rings, Aragon and Narsil, or think of King Arthur and Excalibur. In a lot of these countless fantasy epics, the weapon becomes a symbol of leadership, destiny, and legitimacy. Masters of the Universe initially seems to follow that tradition. Everyone treats the Sword of Power as the source of greatness, the thing that makes the hero special. But the film ultimately takes that idea in a more interesting direction later on. As the story unfolds, we learn that Adam was never simply meant to wield the power, he was meant to embody it. One of the most important conversations in the film comes when the sorcerer explains that Adam's strength is fundamentally different from the champions who came before him. His defining qualities aren't brute force, they aren't aggression, they aren't even his fighting ability. There is humanity, his empathy, his compassion, and his curiosity. And what I appreciate most is how the film commits to that idea all the way through. Because that's something that you need. In filmmaking, in creativity, it's about picking an idea, picking a way of dealing with the material and sticking with it all the way through. By the time we reach the climax, the story has transformed strength from something external into something internal. The power was never really in the sword, the power was in Adam. The sword simply revealed what was already there. For me, that's where the movie comes full circle. The same qualities that caused others to question Adam at the beginning become the very qualities that make him worthy by the end. And that's a far more interesting message than simply telling us that the strongest person wins. Now, is the movie perfect? No. I think there are moments where the mythology feels a little crowded and some supporting characters could have benefited from more development. But those issues never became significant enough to pull me out of the viewing experience. The action delivers. The final confrontation between He-Man and Skeletor is genuinely satisfying. The world feels lived in, and perhaps more importantly, the film finds an emotional core that I wasn't expecting. At its heart, Masters of the Universe is about a young man learning that strength isn't defined by violence, power, or domination. It's defined by character. And in a genre that often confuses strength with force, that's a message that I found refreshing. For me, Masters of the Universe earns a solid 7.5 out of 10. It's not just a better He-Man movie than I expected, it's a better story than I expected. And if you've been on the fence about whether or not to see it, I'd say it's worth taking a trip to Eternia.